There's a daguerreotype in the Massachusetts Historical Society archives that most visitors walk past without noticing. It shows 37 people standing in front of a wooden church. The photograph was taken in 1867 in a town called Ashford Hollow. Every person in that photograph is smiling, every single one. And if you look closely, really closely, you'll notice something else. They all have the same eyes. Not similar eyes, the exact same eyes, same shape, same depth, same unsettling directness. Because they weren't just a congregation, they were an experiment. And for 43 years, no one outside that valley knew what was really happening behind those church doors. What was discovered in 1891 didn't just shock the nation. It revealed that some of the most respected minds in American science had been conducting a study so unethical, so methodically cruel that the government buried the records for over a century. This is the story of Ashford Hollow, and this is the story of the children who were never meant to leave. Hello everyone, before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. In 1848, Dr. Nathaniel Blackwood published a paper that would change his life and destroy hundreds of others. The paper was titled "On the Malleability of Human Character Through Controlled Environment." Blackwood was a physician, a graduate of Harvard Medical School, and a man obsessed with a single question. Could human beings be perfected? Not through education alone, not through religion, but through total environmental control from birth. He believed that crime, poverty, mental illness, all of it was the result of corrupted upbringing. Remove the corruption, he argued, and you could create a generation of ideal citizens. Obedient, productive, free from the moral weaknesses that plagued society. His paper was radical. Most academics dismissed it as utopian fantasy. But three men didn't dismiss it. Dr. Samuel Pritchard, a psychiatrist from Philadelphia, Reverend Josiah Thorne, a Congregationalist minister who believed science and faith could be merged, and Marcus Hale, a wealthy industrialist who had made his fortune in textiles and had very specific ideas about labor efficiency. These four men met in Boston in the winter of 1849. They formed what they called the American Society for Human Perfectibility. It wasn't a secret society, not officially. They published minutes of their meetings. They gave lectures. But what they discussed in private was something else entirely. They wanted to test Blackwood's theory, not through observation, not through theory, but through practice. They wanted to create a controlled human population, raise it from infancy under strict conditions, and document the results. They needed isolation, they needed funding, and they needed children, lots of children. In 1851, they found their location, a valley in western Massachusetts near the Vermont border. It was remote, accessible only by a single dirt road that wound through dense forest. There was a small settlement there, maybe 15 families, farmers mostly, struggling on rocky soil. Blackwood and his partners made them an offer. The society would buy the entire valley. They would build a model community. New homes, a school, a church, a mill for employment. In exchange, the families would stay. They would work for the society, and they would participate in what Blackwood called a social optimization program. Most families accepted. They were poor. The offer was generous. They didn't ask too many questions. A few families refused and were paid to leave. By 1852, Ashford Hollow was entirely owned and operated by the American Society for Human Perfectibility. The first phase was simple. Blackwood and his partners needed children, but not just any children. They needed children they could control completely, children without outside family connections, children who could be raised according to the experiment's design. So they started recruiting. They went to orphanages in Boston, New York, Philadelphia. They offered to take children off the institution's hands. They claimed they were establishing a Christian agricultural community where orphans could learn trades and grow up in wholesome surroundings. They provided references. They had Reverend Thorne's religious credentials. They had Hale's money and social standing. No one questioned it. Between 1852 and 1858, they brought 43 children to Ashford Hollow. Ages ranged from infancy to 12 years old. The children were told they were being adopted into a new kind of family, a community family. They were given new names, biblical names, simple, uniform clothing. They were housed in a dormitory behind the church, and then the conditioning began. Blackwood had designed a system. The children's lives were regulated down to the minute. They woke at 5 a.m. to the sound of a bell. They assembled in rows for morning prayer. They ate meals in silence. They attended school for 6 hours a day where they were taught reading, arithmetic, scripture, and moral philosophy. Blackwood himself wrote the curriculum. Every lesson reinforced the same principles: obedience to authority, suppression of individual desire, the collective good over personal ambition. After school, the children worked, boys in the mill or the fields, girls in the kitchens and laundry. They worked until evening prayer at 7 p.m. Then they were given 1 hour of supervised recreation, which consisted of singing hymns or listening to readings from Blackwood's own writings. At 9 p.m. they went to bed. This was every day. No variation, no holidays, no birthdays. Birthdays, Blackwood believed, encouraged selfish individualism. The children were never alone. Adults monitored them constantly. Monitors, Blackwood called them. These were community members who had been trained in the principles of the experiment. Their job was to observe, to correct, to report. Any deviation from expected behavior was noted in logbooks. A child who laughed too loudly. A child who cried during work. A child who asked too many questions. These behaviors were classified as corruptions, and corruptions had to be corrected. Correction took many forms. Minor infractions resulted in public reprimands. The child would stand before the group during evening assembly and confess their failing. The group would then chant a moral lesson. Repeat offenders were isolated. Blackwood had designed isolation cells in the basement of the church. Small rooms, unlit with just enough space to sit. Children were placed there for hours, sometimes days, with only bread and water. They were told this was for their purification, that solitude would help them reflect and improve. But the most disturbing part of the system wasn't the punishment. It was the reward. Blackwood had created a hierarchy among the children. Those who obeyed perfectly, who showed no signs of corruption, were elevated. They were given better food, better clothing. They were allowed to sit at the front during assemblies. They were praised publicly and given responsibilities over younger children. This created a culture of surveillance. Children monitored each other, they reported each other. Because loyalty to the program was the highest virtue. And loyalty meant exposing corruption wherever it appeared, even in your closest friends. For nearly 20 years, Ashford Hollow operated in near total isolation. The children grew up knowing nothing else. Those who had arrived as infants had no memory of any other life. They believed Blackwood's teachings were universal truth. They believed the outside world was chaotic, sinful, dangerous. They were told they were the fortunate ones, the chosen generation. By the 1870s, the original 43 children had become adults, and this is where the experiment entered its second, darker phase. Blackwood had a problem. His subjects were aging out. If he wanted to continue the study, he needed a second generation. But he couldn't keep bringing in orphans. The children needed to reproduce. So Blackwood arranged marriages. He selected pairs based on what he called complementary behavioral traits. A highly obedient male with a submissive female, a physically strong male with a nurturing female. The goal was to produce children who would inherit optimized characteristics. The subjects didn't object. They had been conditioned to accept authority. When Blackwood told them it was time to marry, they married. When he told them to produce children, they did. Between 1871 and 1885, 31 children were born in Ashford Hollow. These were the second-generation subjects. And Blackwood was meticulous in documenting them. He measured their skulls at birth. He recorded their weight, their reflexes, their first words. He noted every behavioral marker. Did they cry excessively? Did they show attachment to their mothers? Did they resist correction? He was looking for patterns, evidence that his system was working, evidence that human nature could be engineered. But something was going wrong. The second-generation children were different, not better, worse. Several showed signs of developmental delays. Others were prone to violent outbursts. One boy, born in 1873, didn't speak until he was 6 years old. When he finally did speak, he only repeated phrases from Blackwood's moral lessons. He couldn't hold a normal conversation. A girl born in 1876 had seizures that started at age 4. Blackwood documented these as anomalies. Imperfections in the genetic material, he wrote. He didn't consider that perhaps the problem was the environment itself. By 1880, the original funding from Marcus Hale was running out. Hale had died in 1877, and his estate had no interest in continuing his eccentric investments. Blackwood needed money, so he did something desperate. He started selling the children's labor. The boys were contracted out to nearby farms and logging camps. The girls were sent to work as domestic servants in wealthy homes in Boston and Springfield. They were told this was part of their training. Exposure to the corrupted world so they could return and appreciate the purity of Ashford Hollow. But really, Blackwood was using them as a source of income. The children sent their wages back to the society. They had no concept of personal money. They had been taught that individual wealth was a corruption. Everything belonged to the collective. Many never returned. Some died in industrial accidents. Others simply vanished into the cities. Blackwood noted these losses in his records, but he didn't investigate. He had enough subjects remaining. The experiment continued. In 1889, something happened that Blackwood couldn't control. A girl named Abigail, one of the original 43, now 38 years old, walked away from Ashford Hollow and didn't come back. She had been sent to work in a household in Northampton. She was cleaning a library when she found a newspaper. She had been taught to read, but she had never seen a newspaper before. The outside world, she had been told, was too morally degraded to document accurately. But she read it anyway. She read about elections, about inventions, about universities, about women attending college, about labor movements, about a world far more complex and varied than anything Blackwood had described. She realized she had been lied to. Abigail didn't return to Ashford Hollow. She went to the Northampton police and told them everything. At first, they didn't believe her. She seemed disturbed, confused. She spoke in strange, formal phrases. She flinched when people raised their voices, but she was persistent, and she had details, names, dates, descriptions of the isolation cells, the logbooks, the arranged marriages. The police contacted the state attorney general's office. An investigator named Thomas Garrett was assigned to the case. Garrett was skeptical. He had heard rumors about Ashford Hollow over the years. Strange religious commune, people said. Eccentrics, but nothing criminal. He decided to visit. In October 1889, Garrett arrived in Ashford Hollow with 2 deputies. They were met at the valley entrance by monitors who told them the community did not welcome outsiders. Garrett showed them a court order. He had authorization to inspect the premises and interview residents. What he found disturbed him. The adults moved in synchronized patterns. They spoke in rehearsed phrases. They showed no emotion when questioned. When Garrett asked to see the children, he was taken to the dormitory. There were 17 children present, ages ranging from 6 to 15. They sat in perfect rows. They didn't fidget. They didn't make eye contact with the visitors. When Garrett asked them questions, they responded in unison, chanting moral lessons. Garrett asked to speak to one child alone. Blackwood, who was now 71 years old and still overseeing the community, refused. He said isolation corrupted the optimization process. Garrett arrested him on the spot. What followed was one of the strangest legal cases in Massachusetts history. Blackwood was charged with child endangerment, unlawful imprisonment, and fraud. The state seized control of Ashford Hollow and began interviewing every resident. What they discovered was a community that had been psychologically shattered. The adults, now in their 40s and 50s, had no concept of life outside the experiment. They had no skills beyond the repetitive labor they had been assigned. They had no money, no property, no legal identity in many cases. Their births had never been properly recorded. Some didn't even know their original names. The children were even worse off. The second-generation subjects had been so thoroughly conditioned that they couldn't function in normal settings. When removed from Ashford Hollow and placed in foster care or orphanages, they became catatonic. They refused to eat. They rocked back and forth, reciting moral lessons. Several died within months, not from physical illness, but from what doctors at the time called melancholia. We would call it severe psychological trauma. The logbooks were recovered from Blackwood's office. 40 years of meticulous documentation. Daily observations on every child. Notes on punishments, rewards, behavioral modifications. Blackwood had recorded everything with scientific detachment. A boy who cried after being separated from his mother, age 4. Correction applied. Isolation for 6 hours. Result: crying ceased. A girl who asked why she couldn't play outside, age 7. Corruption identified, public reprimand. Result: question not repeated. The logbooks filled 12 crates. They were entered as evidence in Blackwood's trial. The trial began in April 1890. It lasted 6 weeks. The prosecution called former residents as witnesses, including Abigail. She testified for 4 hours. She described the isolation cells, the constant surveillance, the erasure of individual identity. She described watching younger children break under the system. Watching them stop speaking, stop resisting, stop being human in any recognizable way. Blackwood's defense was chilling. He didn't deny anything. He argued that he had committed no crime. He had been conducting legitimate scientific research. The children had been orphans, unwanted by society. He had given them purpose, structure, moral education. Yes, the methods were strict, but strictness was necessary for optimization. He presented his data, charts showing behavioral compliance rates, measurements of productivity. He argued that the suffering was temporary, a necessary phase in creating a perfected population. The jury deliberated for 3 hours. They found him guilty on all counts. He was sentenced to 15 years in prison. He died there in 1894, still insisting his work had been misunderstood. The other founders were never charged. Dr. Pritchard had died in 1883. Reverend Thorne had left the project in 1875, citing theological concerns, though he never reported what he had witnessed. Marcus Hale was already dead. The legal system had no mechanism to hold them accountable posthumously. The residents of Ashford Hollow were dispersed. The state attempted to integrate them into society, but it was largely unsuccessful. Most of the adults ended up in asylums or poorhouses. They couldn't adapt. They had been too damaged. The children fared slightly better, though only slightly. A few were adopted. Most were placed in institutions. Several committed suicide in their 20s and 30s. One, a man named Samuel, who had been born in the community in 1874, wrote a memoir in 1903. It was never published, but the manuscript survives in the Massachusetts State Archives. In it, he describes what it was like to grow up believing you were being perfected, only to discover you had been destroyed. He writes about the confusion of leaving Ashford Hollow, the overwhelming noise and chaos of the outside world, the realization that he had no idea how to talk to people, how to make decisions, how to exist without someone telling him what to do every minute of every day. He describes meeting a woman, falling in love, and then realizing he didn't know what love actually was. He had been taught that love was obedience, that intimacy was a corruption. He couldn't touch her without feeling guilt. He couldn't imagine a future because he had never been allowed to imagine anything. Samuel's memoir ends abruptly. The last entry is dated November 12, 1903. He writes, "I have tried to live in this world. I cannot. I was made for a different world, a world that should never have existed. I am a mistake that walks and breathes." His body was found 3 days later. He had hanged himself in a boarding house in Worcester. He was 29 years old. The community of Ashford Hollow was abandoned. The buildings were left to decay. The church, the dormitory, the mill, all of it slowly collapsed under the weight of New England winters. By the 1920s, the valley was empty. Local teenagers told stories about it. Haunted, they said. You could hear children singing hymns at night. You could see lights in the windows of the old church. None of it was true, but the stories persisted because people needed a way to process what had happened there. Ghosts were easier to accept than the truth. Here's what most people don't know. The records of the Ashford Hollow experiment were sealed by court order in 1895. The state of Massachusetts argued that releasing the full details would serve no public interest and would only cause further harm to the survivors. But that wasn't the real reason. The real reason was that several prominent families were connected to the American Society for Human Perfectibility. Donors, associates, people who had known what Blackwood was doing and had said nothing. If the full scope of the experiment became public, it would have implicated some of the most respected names in Boston society. So the records were buried. The logbooks, the trial transcripts, the testimonies, all of it was locked away in a state archive with restricted access. Researchers had to petition the state for permission to view the materials, and most petitions were denied. It wasn't until 1998 that a historian named Dr. Claire Hutchins successfully argued for access. She spent 3 years going through the documents. What she found was worse than anyone had imagined. Blackwood hadn't just been studying behavioral conditioning. In his later years, he had become obsessed with heredity. He had started arranging marriages not just based on behavioral traits, but on physical ones. He was trying to breed specific characteristics: height, strength, eye color. He kept detailed genetic charts, though he didn't understand genetics in the modern sense. He was working from Lamarckian theories, the idea that acquired traits could be inherited. It was pseudoscience, but he believed it. And he had experimented on human beings based on that belief. Dr. Hutchins published her findings in 2003 in a book titled The Children of Ashford Hollow, America's Forgotten Experiment. The book caused a brief media stir. A few articles were written. A documentary was discussed but never produced. And then, once again, the story faded. Because it's uncomfortable. It's a story about respected men doing monstrous things in the name of progress. It's a story about how easy it is to dehumanize people when you convince yourself you're helping them. And it's a story that asks a question no one wants to answer. How many other Ashford Hollows were there? Today, the valley where Ashford Hollow once stood is state forest land. There's a small parking area and a hiking trail. If you follow the trail about 2 miles in, you'll find the foundations of the old buildings. stone and rotted wood, mostly overgrown. There's a metal plaque placed there by the State Historical Society in 2005. It reads, Site of Ashford Hollow, 1851-1891. A community founded on utopian ideals that resulted in harm to many. We remember the victims and acknowledge the failures of those who did not protect them. It's vague, deliberately so. The full story is too dark for a roadside marker. But if you visit in the fall when the leaves are down and the light comes through the trees at a certain angle, you can still see the outline of where the church stood. You can see the depression in the ground where the dormitory was. You can stand there and try to imagine what it was like for a child in that place. A child who was told every day that they were being perfected, that their suffering had purpose, that obedience was love. And you can ask yourself, what did they dream about? Did they dream at all? Or had that been conditioned out of them too? There are no survivors left. The last known resident of Ashford Hollow died in 1964. But the damage didn't end with that generation. Several of the second-generation subjects had children before they died. Those children grew up with parents who couldn't parent, who didn't know how to show affection, who flinched at raised voices and couldn't handle disorder. Some of those children are still alive. In her research, Dr. Hutchins tracked down 3 of them. They agreed to be interviewed on the condition of anonymity. 1. A woman now in her 70s described her mother as a ghost, present but not present. She would cook, clean, care for her children mechanically, but there was no warmth, no spontaneity. She never sang. She never played. When the woman was 8, she asked her mother why she never smiled. Her mother said, "I was taught that smiling without purpose is a corruption." She said it as if it was obvious, as if everyone knew that. The woman didn't understand until years later, when she found a newspaper clipping about Ashford Hollow. She confronted her mother. Her mother didn't deny it. She just said, "That was a long time ago," and never spoke of it again. Another descendant, a man in his 60s, said his father had violent nightmares. He would wake up screaming about bells and darkness. He couldn't be in small spaces, closets, elevators, anything enclosed would trigger panic attacks. He refused to explain why. He died of a heart attack at age 52. It was only after his death that the man found a box in his father's attic. Inside were letters. Letters his father had written but never sent. Letters to Dr. Blackwood. Letters that said, "You told us we were chosen. You told us we would be better. I am not better. I am broken, and I don't know how to fix what you did to me." The man said he burned the letters. He couldn't stand to read them. The story of Ashford Hollow is not unique. Throughout the 19th and early 20th centuries, America was full of utopian experiments, communities founded on idealistic principles that often masked authoritarian control. Most of them failed quietly. A few, like Ashford Hollow, failed catastrophically. What makes Ashford Hollow particularly disturbing is the scientific veneer. Blackwood genuinely believed he was advancing human knowledge. He documented everything because he thought future generations would see him as a pioneer. He thought history would vindicate him. It didn't. History buried him. And maybe that's the right response. Maybe some experiments don't deserve to be remembered as science. Maybe they deserve to be remembered as what they actually were. Cruelty disguised as curiosity. But the victims deserve to be remembered. The 43 children who arrived in that valley between 1852 and 1858. The 31 children born there between 1871 and 1885. The monitors and workers who were manipulated into participating. They all deserve to be more than a footnote in a history book that no one reads. So here's what we know for certain. Their names, at least the ones we have records of: Abraham, Abigail, Benjamin, Deborah, Elijah, Esther, Isaac, Leah, Nathaniel, Rachel, Samuel, Sarah. 31 others whose names were changed so many times that their original identities are lost. We know they suffered, we know they were told their suffering had meaning, and we know that some of them in their final years realized it didn't. The meaning was invented, the purpose was a lie, and by the time they understood that, it was too late to reclaim the lives that had been taken from them. If you've made it this far, you've heard a story most people don't know. A story about what happens when ideology overrides empathy. When progress is valued more than people. When children become data points in someone else's vision of perfection. Ashford Hollow is gone. But the impulse that created it isn't. The belief that human beings can be engineered, optimized, controlled for their own good. That impulse survives, it just wears different faces now, different language. But the core is the same, and that's why stories like this matter, not because they're shocking, but because they're warnings. Warnings that we don't always hear until it's too late. Leave a comment. Tell us what you think. Tell us if you've ever heard of Ashford Hollow before. Tell us if you think something like this could happen today. And if you believe it couldn't, ask yourself why you're so sure. Because certainty, especially about human nature, is exactly how places like Ashford Hollow begin.